Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar and deputy director of education policy here at the American Enterprise Institute. Happy to welcome you today to a presentation on the findings of the 2018 Schooling in America survey. We're lucky enough to have Paul and his team come over from EdChoice and present this every year, and we have another fascinating set of results to present today. We have a fairly simple program. I'll give a brief introduction to Paul, after which he'll come on up and present the results of the survey, wide-ranging. So buckle up and be ready to imbibe from the fire hydrant. After that, we'll try and break some of that down with some moderated discussion, which I'll moderate. We have a great panel, and I'll introduce them when we sit down. We'll do that for about a half hour, and then we'll take questions from the audience. The event is currently being live streamed. It'll also be available immediately after we're done here online. There's a way for our online audience to participate, and actually you in the audience as well. Here we have a hashtag that's hashtag Schooling in America. Without punctuation, and you can put together questions on Twitter and either use the hashtag. You could tweet them at me. I'm at Nat Malkus, and that way we can get your questions into the Q&A once we get that started. Please silence cell phones and be ready for a live event. Without further ado, I'll introduce Paul DePerna. He's the Vice President of Research and Innovation at EdChoice, where he oversees EdChoice's research projects, which have been more than 100 over the past decade in terms of reports, papers, and briefs, a steady flow of good quality work. Before joining EdChoice, Paul was the Assistant Director at the Brown Center for Education, just a couple of doors down here on Massachusetts Avenue at the Brookings Institution. So, Paul, I'll invite you up, and you can take us through the results.
Thanks, Nat, for the nice introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. For those of you who don't know EdChoice, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts and commissions research on school choice issues in K-12 education. And we use the research base, our own, as well as others, to inform policymakers and influencers at the state and local levels around the country, as well as here in Washington, D.C. EdChoice is a charter member of the Transparency Initiative that's led by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And before we get going with the presentation, I really want to say a special thank you to Nat, Connor Kurtz, Rick Hess, and the whole AEI, Education Policy Studies team who are hosting the event today. They're always wonderful to work with. This is, I think, the fifth year now that we've released our annual national survey here at AEI. And so we really appreciate all the work that you do to put together this event. I also want to credit and recognize my co-author, Mike Shaw, who did an amazing job crunching the numbers and doing some of the writing for this publication that we released today, as well as my other EdChoice colleagues who have been working tirelessly over the last couple months to get this report ready to be released before the holidays. So I want to say thanks to those guys in Indianapolis. And I also want to say how grateful I am for our partnership with Braun Research, who has been our survey partner now for almost a decade, and they've been really terrific conducting the online surveys and also administering the phone interviews for our surveys. And so I just want to say thank you to them. And but before we get started, what I'd like to do first is just acknowledge the fact that we, as we all know, that the country has been in mourning at the loss of President George Bush, and as well as celebrating his life today and this week. And so the other night, I was just going through online and just digging through clips and videos of past speeches that President Bush had given throughout his presidency and in his public service life. And one really struck me, and I thought I'd share a quick audio clip that I thought was especially relevant for why we're here today. and connects nicely to the kind of subjects that are engaged by the poll.
We must work together over the next 2 days, but more importantly, over the next several years. We're going to talk about many issues, most importantly, choice and competitiveness and teaching quality and improving the learning environment. Accountability, flexibility, tougher standards, a results-oriented system, all of these have got to be out there on the table. And what I'm seeking at this summit is not just dialogue, but a new sense of direction. We've got to challenge the education system if we're to meet the challenge of educational excellence.
And so those remarks were opening remarks at a national education summit that President Bush had convened in the fall of 1989. He invited the nation's governors to come and talk about K-12 education issues in Charlottesville, Virginia, not too far away. And it was a first of its kind type of summit to focus on K-12 education issues. And two observations really struck me. His leadership to put together that kind of summit and to cast a national spotlight on very hot topics and timely issues involving K-12 education, things like accountability, standards, choice and competition, teacher quality, and matters that affect the teaching profession. And another observation that really struck me was just how prescient he was in kind of forecasting those types of issues and subjects that were going to be part of public debates in the 90s and the 2000s to come. And so I just wanted to take a second and to acknowledge his leadership and his prescient view. And I think that really frames some of those subjects were what we asked in our questionnaire for the Schooling in America survey. So I'll just take a moment to go through and quickly give you a profile of the who, what, or who, when, how, and what of our survey. And so EdChoice partnered with Braun Research, who I mentioned a moment ago, to conduct phone interviews and administer an online survey this past fall. And these took place in September through the first week of October. And we did this both online and over the phone, and that's the first time we've done this, where in the past we've done your standard live phone interviews. This year we combined and collected both phone and online. And as far as the subject matter, there are some questions that we hold on to every year, and we ask every year about national direction of K-12 education, what people believe and their views on K-12 education spending. What are parents' schooling experiences? What are their own preferences for schooling their children, and why? We ask about standardized testing and also educational choice reforms like school vouchers, education savings accounts, charter schools, and tax credit scholarships. So what's different this year? This year we had this separate survey of current public school teachers, so teachers who are in full-time teaching in K, at least one grade in K through 12. And we asked about their professional experiences and their views of their work life and who they trust among stakeholders, and other questions around accountability, testing, and school choice reforms. And just to take a note, that there are other organizations that have released surveys over the last year. Educators for Excellence did their own survey of public school teachers. Phi Delta Kappan released their annual poll back in August. EdNext, they do their annual survey and release that usually right after Labor Day. And I'd encourage everybody to look at those surveys too, and I think that provides a nice kind of landscape as to where public opinion is in 2018 on K-12 education issues. So why don't we go right through the survey findings, and what I'll do is go through about roughly like a dozen core findings that we found as part of this project this year. And then, as Nat mentioned, there is a fire hose and just quite a few charts that will be coming your way, and I'll just try to hit some of the main points. And so first we'll start with these warm-ups, with some of the warm-up questions. And we ask folks where they think K-12 education is going today. Is it going in the right direction or is off on the wrong track? And about a third of Americans believe that K-12 education is going in the right direction. And that's actually an 8-point increase since last year. So there is a jump. But more than half still see K-12 education off on the wrong track. And you can see here on the far right, 55% said wrong track, 35% said right direction. And it's been pretty stable over time, but we do see this uptick in positive sentiment about the direction of K-12. We also asked questions about spending in public education. And this is a consistent finding year to year that we see Americans really do not know how much we spend on a per student basis, a per student per year basis, and how much we spend in public schools. And when we give them an actual spending statistic, we see that they're less likely to say that public school funding is too low, so information matters. And on this bar chart here, you can see the counts of the respondents who volunteered specific answers to the question of whether or not how much they thought was being spent in public schools. And on the far left, you see 212 people said that we spend $1,000 per year, per student per year in public schools. And then on the far right, we see that there were 70 respondents who thought that we spend $50,000 per student per year in the public schools. And so the big takeaway here, though, is this purple chunk, that's 55% of our respondents said that we spend $5,000 or less on per student. And that's less than half of what the actual spending number is, which is approximately $11,500. And just as a side note, of the more than 1,500 people in our survey that volunteered a response and tried to estimate their best answer to this question, only one was able to guess and estimate the 11,500 statistic. So then we did an experiment where we split the sample that we have, a nationally representative statistical sample, and we split it in half. So one half received a question about public school funding with no information, no specific information, and then we asked the other half, we gave them that specific statistic. And when we do that, we see how much opinion differs. So without the information, without that $11,454 statistic, 62% of the general population think that public school funding is too low. But with that information, 43% say it's too low. So there's a 19-point difference there. And it shows that information matters, especially, at least in this example, on spending in K-12 education. So moving on to what did parents say in our survey? What matters to them? On average, majorities of parents in our survey express satisfaction with their own schooling experiences, no matter what type of school, whether it is public district school, public charter school, private school, or homeschooling. And so you can see that at least 2/3 who said they were satisfied, either somewhat or very satisfied with their schooling experience, and 66% saying they were satisfied with their public district school experience, 78% of charter schoolers, 79% of private schoolers, 86% of homeschoolers. And I should note that some of the faded out bars are the results from last year, and we did see, so the levels are high, but we did see a dip since last year, particularly among the public district school response and the private school response. So how do parents grade their local schools? And so we asked, and this is not their school where they're sending a child, but their local area schools, their community, the schools in their community. And we see that 75% gave an A or B to private schools in their area, 62% an A or B to charter schools, and just over half an A or B to their public district schools. And these are pretty consistent, even with some of the other surveys that have been released in the past couple of years. So then we followed up with a couple questions about what do parents do to support their children's education? What kind of sacrifices are they making, big or small? And so compared to 2 years ago when we asked these items, it looks like parents are doing more to support and accommodate their children's education. And so we asked, what have you done to support your child's education? And we see that there's been almost a doubling of those who said they took an additional job, or moved from 22% in 2016 to 40% this year. And also 17% said they changed a job in 2016. That almost doubled to 30% this year. And so parents are making sacrifices for their children's education. What have they done to accommodate for their children's education, at least 4 months of the school year? And so we'll all be happy to see that 9 out of 10 say they're helping their children with homework at least one night a week, and that's really not changed since 2 years ago. And at least half say they have had a family member or friend either look after a child or help transport their child in order to help with the educational motivations and what they're doing for their children. And those responses have gone up since 2016. But the biggest mover, though, is this one where parents are saying that they're paying for their child's transportation at a higher rate than 2 years ago. So 32%, almost a third, said they're paying for transportation in our survey this year. 15% said the same 2 years ago. So then we move into, we talked about experiences and what they are actually doing. And now we're moving to their preferences and what they actually believe and what they hope for, and particularly around schooling. And we see that huge gaps exist between parents' private preferences on what type of school they would like to choose to give the best education for their child, and compare that with actual school type enrollments and the patterns that we see out in the real world. Here's what I mean. So the bottom bar shows the proportions of students who are attending schools in each of those sectors. So 82% of students today are attending public district schools, 5% charter schools, 10% are going to private schools, and 3%, it's estimated, the best data that's out there from the U.S. Department of Education says 3% are homeschooling. And then look at the private preferences, what they're saying to us in the interviews. 36% would choose a public district school. 40% would choose a private school, which is 4 times the proportion of the relative enrollment that we see today. 13% say they would choose a charter school, and 10% say they would like to homeschool. Okay, so now we're going from a focus on parents, and so what did the teachers say in our survey this year? And so we see that current public school teachers, and they're showing a lot of unease and discontent with their profession as measured by the Net Promoter Score question that we asked in our survey. And that's probably not any big surprise considering everything that we saw in the news over the last year with the teacher protests and walkouts and strikes in places like North Carolina, Oklahoma, Arizona, and some other states. And so this was very much in the news this year. And so this just kind of seems to reinforce what we're seeing. And so the Net Promoter Score question it's a very common question that's been asked in consumer surveys and service provider surveys in the last 10 to 15 years. And essentially it asks on a 0 to 10 rating scale, how likely are you to recommend something to a friend or a colleague? And that something in our survey was teaching in the public schools. And we see that 26%, by the definitions of the Net Promoter Score scale, 26% were promoters of the profession. 42% were actually detractors, so anyone who gave a rating of 0 to 6. And then you take the difference, and that's what gives you this NPS score. And the NPS was minus 17. And so that minus 17 fits into a range from minus 100 to plus 100. That's a 200-point range, just to give you a sense where it fits. And the average rating was about 6.5, 6.5. And so by comparison, we've asked this question to other populations in our surveys, and we asked the same question to state legislators a few years ago and last year to active duty military service members. And just by relative comparison, active duty military, their NPS was plus 45. State legislators was plus 41. By comparison, teachers are at minus 17. So that's a pretty stark contrast. So then we ask questions about trust. Who do they trust? Who do teachers trust today? And this might not be surprising, but they say they trust their students and they trust their school principals. And they're less inclined to trust their students' parents and public officials or government agencies. And so you see more than half say they trust students and principals, 57% on the high side that they say they trust principals. But look at the bottom, that only just a quarter of current public school teachers say they trust the U.S. Department of Education, State Department of Education. Only a third say they trust their local school board, and just over a third say they trust their students' parents. Current public school teachers said that they hold their local school districts most responsible for the recent walkouts, protests, and strikes. And by contrast, the public are more likely to fault teachers' unions more than any other stakeholder. And so if you look at the first set of bars, those are the responses from public school teachers. You see that 60% of teachers said that they hold local districts responsible. And then next was state government at 54%. It was a little bit mixed among school parents and where they assigned responsibility. And then you can see the general public was a little bit more likely to say that the teachers union was responsible for these recent disruptions from teacher walkouts and protests. So then we also asked a question, something that was very much in the news and people were paying attention to, at least in the education space, the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision around Janus versus AFSCME. And that was a decision that in effect banned or prohibited mandatory union agency fees for public sector employees, regardless of whether or not they belong to the union. And so what we did is we did another experiment where we asked a question 3 different ways with different varying levels of specificity, and to see where people stood on this banning of mandatory agency fees. And we see that initially, on a very general question, it's really mixed across the board for teachers, parents, or the general public. And where just under half said that they supported the ban or the prohibition. But then the blue bars, that's where we actually inserted language that cited the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Janus. And with that information, it made the opinion spike, and most pronounced among current public school teachers, where almost 6 out of 10 said that they then supported that decision. So kind of like the spending split sample experiment, we see that with more information, more specific information, that can really affect how people respond. Moving on to accountability. Teachers, parents, and the public, they want to keep matters as local as possible when it comes to accountability in K-12. And here you can see that most people would like to see teachers have the most say in developing accountability systems. And we see those yellow bars represent those items where teachers differed from the public or parents. And you can see that they would like to see teachers involved, also principals. Teachers would like to see principals more involved. And then there was another difference where a smaller proportion, and relatively so compared to parents, where teachers, only a third said that parents should really be involved in developing a state accountability system. Same pattern holds up when we asked about who should have control in implementing a state accountability system. So these are just really basic questions. They were not very policy specific. Same pattern, teachers trust teachers and principals, and a little bit less so among parents. So then we asked about what should be the broad purpose for an accountability system. And there was some agreement across these groups that ensuring minimum standards for reading and math learning, as well as identifying low-performing schools for assistance, that those should be just broad principles and priorities for an accountability system compared to other mentioned objectives in the survey. And you can see here that about 60% across the board said ensuring minimum standards for math and reading. And then on the identifying low-performing schools for assistance, teachers responded a little bit differently than parents and the general public. So then, moving from where we saw what appeared to be some agreement, to there were areas where there was no agreement, and it just seemed like there was no consensus on who should be held most responsible when it comes to accountability, nor what is most important to evaluate or measure in a state accountability system. And I'll go through these really quickly, but what you can see here is that school districts here are at the top, but the highest percentage that said school districts, that mentioned school districts and gave it a highest priority was just a third among teachers, about a third for parents, and about 39% among the general public. But for the most part, responses varied across the board for different stakeholders. And then the same was true about what should be evaluated. So we gave 10 items that they could rank order in terms of what they think should be most important for evaluation. School safety was at the top, but it was a plurality. And then came student achievement, student attainment, student behavior, and then responses really were mixed beyond that. But it's interesting to see that there just didn't seem to be much consensus over purpose, over what should be evaluated. And I think that's where some of the conversations are today when it comes to accountability. Surprising numbers of public school teachers and parents say they're unsure if their state even uses grades, A to F grades, or ratings for accountability purposes. And so this is kind of it's an interesting finding looking at the I'm unsures or I don't know responses. And you can see that about almost 1 out of 5 public school teachers didn't know if their home state used A to F grades or ratings for accountability. And 3 out of 10 parents said the same, and almost 4 out of 10, or 37% of the general public didn't know. But I think what struck me was the response, relatively substantial responses from teachers and parents just not knowing whether or not they had some type of a rating system. More than half of teachers think that we're spending too much time on standardized testing. And that's even compared to roughly about a third of parents and the general public. And testing being kind of the tip of the spear in a lot of cases for accountability frameworks. And so you see, just looking at the red chunks, those are the 2 high responses of the 3 groups, teachers, parents, and the public. And you see the 52% of teachers said that we're spending too much time on testing. Smaller proportions among parents and the public. So then we'll move to the last part of our survey where we asked folks about their awareness and their opinions on school choice reforms, education savings accounts, vouchers, charter schools, and tax credit scholarships. I should ask, how many people here are familiar with education savings accounts? Okay, everybody, that's great. So what we learned, and just as a side note, we don't have this in the slides, but there are still substantial numbers and proportions of people who still say they're unfamiliar or they don't know or don't have an opinion of those different types of school choice reforms. But we've been asking these questions now for 6 years, and we see that support for choice-based reforms remains high, and in some cases are at the highest levels that we've seen yet. The margins are really large, and I think in a lot of ways the margins really tell a lot of the story. Sometimes we'll see folks are twice as likely or 4 times as likely to say they support ESAs, vouchers, charters, or tax credit scholarships. And so we see here, starting with education savings accounts, on the far right, in 2018, 74% of the public said that they support ESAs, and that's the largest number we've seen to date. Things were going down around 2016, but they've been going up in the last couple of years. And you can see that just 18% said they oppose ESAs, and so the general public is 4 times as likely, about 4 times as likely to say they support ESAs. What about school vouchers? See, 64% say they support school vouchers based on our survey question. 30% oppose, so it's a doubling. People are twice as likely to say that they favor vouchers. And that's also fairly consistent with what we've seen in the past. And we did see a dip around 2016, and things have gone up about 7 points in the last 2 years in terms of those who support vouchers. Charter schools, 61% say they support charter schools, 29% say they oppose. And the dip we saw with charters was back in 2015, and things have been going up. Things stayed the same since last year, but things went up from 15 to 17, and then it looks like we've had a little bit of leveling off. And then for tax credit scholarships, we're back to where we were in 2013. identical numbers. So we see 2 out of 3 respondents said they support tax credit scholarships. The biggest one, just as an example, is in Florida. More than 100,000 students are served by the program there. 24% in our survey said that they oppose tax credit scholarships. So there's just a big margin. So we see these margins of 25 to 30 percentage points or more for these different choice categories. And so just to quickly wrap up, I just want to say that these surveys and polls can give voice to the public and to different groups. And it can give broader context to public debates and the heated rhetoric that we see on social media and the constant streaming of updates of current events. But it can really bring some perspective, especially when you're able to look at polls that not just that we do, but just the cross-section of polls, even just this last year, can really be informed. We hope that they can be informative to policymakers and to advocates and to other kind of stakeholders in K-12 education. And with that, I just want to say thank you. And the publication and the questionnaire, if you're interested, and the raw results are posted on our website at edchoice.org. And I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
The panelists to join me up here, so I won't have to go it alone. The report is here. It's beautiful. It's heavy reading. There's lots of detail in it, and I encourage you to read it. This is just in case I need to cite a particular number. We have a great panel today. Let me take a minute and introduce our panelists. From right to left, George Parker is a senior fellow at Students First Institute and a senior advisor and board member for My Child, My Choice. He's a certified math teacher with 30 years experience in high school and middle school here in Washington, D.C. public schools. Mr. Parker is the former president of the Washington Teachers Union and in 2010 negotiated the groundbreaking reform contract for teachers. And we're lucky to have him here. Next to him is Tony Bennett, a partner with Strategos Group, which is a national public affairs firm based in Florida, but he spent a good part of his career in Indiana, starting out as a high school teacher and moving on to administration. And then in 2009, he served as Indiana's superintendent of public instruction. And he also went from there to serve as the commissioner of education in Florida. And likewise, we're lucky to have Tony. Visha Wilson-Hawkins is a parent advocate and blogger from Nashville, Tennessee. Visha used to work in Nashville public schools, but has since gone into local politics and blogging with the Education Post. And she's dedicated to the plight of low-income families of color in public schools. She's also the co-founder of One Voice blog magazine. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to kick off our conversation. These are not questions from me just to one of you and back to me again, so feel free to jump in. But I want to start out with the big picture and what our panelists think might be reflected in the opinion results. And my question is, when we have a year, as Paul mentioned, where we had teacher walkouts in the red states, this is a big story. We had the Janus decision, which was a bombshell in the education community. And we've had sort of the ongoing push and pull with the DeVos administration's sort of controversial support of school choice and the accompanying pushback to that. Those are all sort of more recent trends. Of course, we also have perennial issues like school quality and accountability, funding, and our respect for teachers. So I'm wondering, what do you think is reflected in these opinion data? Are they being shaped by more recent trends, or are we just holding steady?
Nat, I'll take first swing then.
Fantastic.
I think there's a bit of pendulum swinging, Nat. I mean, I think we went through some periods where, the kind of the reform initiatives were being pushed really hard. I'll kind of just generically say 2009 to that 2013-14. Then we got the pushback, and I think now we're actually starting to see, again, more leveling back to folks want change in education. I think it still strikes me. People want to see education change fundamentally for the benefit of children. But I think they are a little tempered that they want to be certain that folks who they think are very noble and honorable servants to children, who are our teachers, are not vilified. And I think so what we're seeing is an overall temperance of those kind of factors.
I think that also, I was a little surprised on one of the data points, and that is that teachers didn't have the same trust level for parents that they had for their administrators and students. That was kind of surprising to me. But the one factor that I think is consistent to data that I found when I was union president of the Washington Teachers Union, and that is that teachers do want to be empowered in terms of accountability and et cetera, that teachers had always felt that their voices were the voices that were least listened to. And so I agree 100% with that survey. I think that a lot of the discussions about choice and accountability over the last several years has caused teachers to move to the place where they are now ready to take more of a leadership role. Because in my discussions with a lot of teachers have kind of felt that that change is being done to them as opposed to being done with them. And when you look at the demonstrations in North Carolina and other places, I think that's an indication that teachers now are beginning to feel that they are going to have to play a key role in terms of helping people get this right. And I'm glad to see that.
Nick, can I push back just a little bit
Yeah,
on that?
absolutely.
Because I want to bring out a thing that really caused I was a little conflicted in it. And that's the fact that I think I read this correctly, so Paul, you may have to correct me if I didn't. Teachers saw the local school district as the basic issue that they have. Am I right?
Related to the walkouts.
Mm-hmm. Related to the walkouts.
Yeah.
Yet, their immediate action is to go to the state and walk out. And I find that to be a little puzzling, because to me, we live in a locally driven education system. And, being a person who sees today public school districts expand central offices and the number of school districts where we could get economies of scale if we did some school service consolidation. I know school consolidation is sometimes a dirty word, but the response from teachers is, let's go to the State House and demonstrate, yet our problem is at the local level. And for me, that caused a little bit, it's like it kind of caused me to scratch my head.
I think a lot of that could be state funding. And that, I know from a union perspective, we've always looked at starting with the funding. And the funding started with the state and moves down to the local. And I think that is one of the reasons why you saw the protests pretty much dealing with states. And I think to some degree, teacher accountability starts at the state level. I know that in a lot of my movement around the country, the state level is where a lot of the accountability programs are put into place, and the funding, especially this concept. And it was interesting to see how much consistently that teachers were not very favorable to standardized testing. It would have been interesting to see whether or not that lower percentage where teachers are looking at standardized testing, would that have been the same if there had not been a lot of discussion and movement toward holding teachers accountable through the use of standardized testing? Because I taught 30 years, and it was only recently that I saw such a focus on resistance to standardized testing, because we had been doing standardized testing for all 30 years of my teaching. I think that when states, and this again, the states, began to talk about we're going to make input accountability, whereas teachers are going to be held accountable based on student standardized testing, is where a lot of the resistance began to come into place as well.
Yeah, Visha, I want to bring you in here a little bit, and I don't want to put too big of a burden on you. I just want you to speak for all parents in the survey. But I did notice a little bit of a divide that I want you to comment on. The general attitude, we sort of saw the folks that, or the percentage of folks who thought that we're going in the wrong direction actually hold steady. But nonetheless, we saw a big jump in the percentage of folks who are sort of coming off the fence and saying, no, we're going in the right direction. So the general public seems to think that, or at least more of us are going in the right direction. Parents, however, had the exact same grades of their local schools, private, charter, public, and they also report this lower satisfaction, right? So their satisfaction scores are sort of going in the opposite direction. I'm wondering if you're seeing daylight between maybe the opinions that parents who are currently involved in public schools are seeing in our education system vis-a-vis the general public who has a little bit of a thousand-yard view.
So what I think what struck me from looking at the data is parents are saying that the schools at K through 12 education is going in the wrong direction. They pretty much like their schools, but one of the key things that I've looked at is in this study is their actions, right? They are sacrificing more, as Paul said earlier, right? They're paying for transportation, they are changing jobs, they're getting second jobs, they're moving closer to schools, right? So actions always speak louder than words to me, and so that is saying that's speaking volumes for me. And then when you get to the parent attitudes about the choice options, the choice programs, it was shocking to me to see such a high favorability amongst public school parents, for vouchers, for ESAs, for tax credit scholarships. I mean, those things shocked me to see such a high favorability rating, because we don't, in my world, I don't hear from those parents, right? I don't hear those points of view. So I think there's something that President Bush said in the video or in the audio played earlier, and that was we need to challenge the education system, and that's something that I focus on, that I write a lot about, and I think that's what parents are doing. Like, they are not committed they're not loyal to the system as they once were. I mean, they are seeing that there are other ways to do this thing. And so that's what plus the trust factor that George talked about. So I've been thinking about that all night. Like, that is bothering me. So teachers rank, they trust parents on the same level as school board members and federal and state bureaucrats. And so that, I just need to go talk to some teachers about that.
That's quite a statement.
We got to have a conversation about that.
Well, let's push a little bit on the school choice findings since you brought them up.
Now, before you do that,
absolutely.
Because I think it's a really interesting thing that she just said. Because I think if you ask parents, who do they trust the most? Mm-hmm. If you ask parents who they trust the most on that scale, who are they going to say?
Teachers.
They're going to say the teachers.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter how good or bad a teacher is.
Right.
A parent will trust their child's teacher more than they'll trust anyone else regarding the care of their child. And yet, in response, there's not that reciprocity. And that really struck me. Like you said, I appreciate you bringing that up.
That surprised me, too.
So on the school choice responses, the survey results paint a very positive picture for a lot of school choice. So just speaking broadly about choice and charters and the support they have. I wonder what your take is on the question of, is this a bag that's half full or half empty? And by that I mean, have we seen a lot of support and not a lot of movement on choice out in the states? Or maybe it's half full and we've seen the movement we had because there's been so much positive sentiment in the public behind them, and therefore we might expect a continued amount of runway for school choice proposals.
I see the glass is half full. I mean, I see, I'm all about information, and Paul was very clear. He said it about 2 or 3 times, thank you, which information matters. And parents are getting information. I mean, I'd like to see them get more information more often. But parents are becoming more aware of the choices. And maybe there's some stagnation in certain areas, but they are becoming aware. And that, to me, is a half glass full moment.
I agree with that. I think information has made the difference. Now, good information and bad information. And I have to admit that as previously, there was a point in my life where I was opposed to choice, and to some degree was the proponent of bad information to parents to kind of stop school choice. That's just the reality. But I think as parents began to get better information, they're beginning to warm up to school choice. And I warmed up to school choice myself when I got out of the basket of personal desire and personal need, right? Because as a union president, I looked at school choice as competition to my very survival. That's a reality. But I think I was on a session in Indianapolis on Sunday where we were talking about is school choice a black choice, and I believe it is. But I talked with the union leader just Monday night who was a little upset with me for my position in terms of saying at this point in my life is by any means necessary, we got to educate kids. And I said to him, school choice to me is kind of like rap music. I used to be a recording artist in the early 70s, and we did predominantly what was R&B music, right, rhythm and blues. Well, in the late 70s and early 80s, here comes rap music. And so there was many of us who said, it's going away, don't worry about it. It's
a great analogy.
Right, it's going to be here for a minute, people are going to get tired of it, it's going to disappear. 30-some years later, and rap music now is at the forefront of everything. I think school choice is the same. And I was saying to him, school choice, just go back and look at rap music. School choice is here to stay because when the traditional public schools are not able to educate your children the way that parents want their children educated, eventually they are going to look for other options. And we're in that situation today. I think school choice, the reality is it is here to stay.
Well, let's push on those options just a little bit, and then I'll give you a chance to weigh in there, Paul. But, when I was looking at the margins between the 4 options that were put out, which were ESAs, tax credits, vouchers, and charters, in that order, the margins got less favorable. And charters seem to have, particularly for some subgroups, less support than private schools. Now, that strikes me as a little bit odd. Charters have a much bigger market share. They have a large constituency. They've got some numbers that can be pretty convincing. So were you surprised to see a division? And Paul, feel free to weigh in here if I'm making too much of those marginal differences.
No, I think, so we see it in our poll. I believe EdNext has seen it in their annual survey too, where, public opinion on charter schools took a dip a couple years ago, but then what we've seen is some bounce back recently. And it's striking, even looking at the differences of opinion between public school teachers, parents, and the general public, and how there's some convergence and divergence depending on the type of school choice program that we asked about. But charters and vouchers were almost about roughly the same on the margins, where I believe it was for teachers where it was 54% said they supported vouchers, which that surprised me. That was higher than I thought. But then opposition was also around, I think it was 46%. So there's about an 8-point margin there. Parents were in the other direction where almost 7 out of 10 parents supported vouchers, much lower number opposed. So I think that, and then what we see, and this kind of goes back to your previous question about, whether glass half full, half empty on choice and what type of choice. And I mean, I think so much of our focus, and mine in particular, our organization, we focus on public policy and implementation. And we see that I think we've seen consolidation of some programs, and maybe not as many new programs have started in recent years. But what's really telling to me is those programs that are in place right now, the numbers that I see in terms of growth rates, we're still seeing like the Indiana School Voucher Program, the Choice Scholarship Program. That's growing every year. We see Florida's Tax Credit Scholarship Program. And more than 100,000 students participate in that program, and that's growing every year. And depending on the type of program, and for charter schools, we've seen some slowing of growth, but still enrollments are still growing, and that's where I'm optimistic. And I think it's just that inevitable movement and push towards more choice, where parents are feeling more empowered and voting with their feet.
So, Nat, I'm a guy who says the glass is a lot more than half full, because I really do believe choice is here to stay, and I don't think you can, once you give such large segments of the population something, you can't take it away. So I think it's here to stay. I think there's some interesting pieces to it. For instance, Paul mentioned Indiana, and being from Indiana, having been state superintendent, and actually having a little bit to do with the passage of the voucher program there, I can tell you the thing that I think was most successful about that, and the thing that has been most successful about Indiana probably has the wild west of school choice, wouldn't you say? I mean, we've got probably as much school choice as anybody in America.
Including public school choice.
And that's where I'm going.
Open
enrollment to public schools. I mean, we probably have, 8 to 9%, 10% of our population in private and charters. And we probably have double that exercising some type of choice in their public schools.
Wow.
But what has it done? It's made our public schools better. And what was the original intent of school choice besides equity? The first thing was equitable education for children, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their race, regardless of socioeconomics. We wanted equity in education. But the other thing was to insert a market-driven approach to education to force our public schools to treat families like customers. And it's worked. And I think that's why folks support choice. I do believe this. It has raised all of our boats in the harbor, including our public schools. And I think that's a very positive thing.
So, I don't want it to be too happy up here, so let's move to a glass half empty. George, I'll ask you this. Why are teachers so down on their profession? 3/4, am I getting this right? 3/4 on their Net Promoter Score are just not really willing to refer other people to be teachers. They're saying, don't come here. And, we see this in the breakouts, which, again, I encourage you to look because there's a lot more texture. You see this even with new teachers. They're not going to promote their profession. But experienced teachers are more likely to say, you don't want to do this job. I'm trying to understand why that's such a strong sentiment.
I think number one is teachers not feeling empowered. Decisions are always made for them. Secondly, I think teachers feel that they have been the scapegoat for the failures of all school systems. And so I think that it's a direct reflection of teachers feel that everyone is blaming them for why schools aren't succeeding. But a bigger picture, though, is teachers feeling disempowered. Everything is always done to you, right? It's like teachers are the drivers of the cars, right? And so teachers are saying, look, they can give us a rundown car. We had nothing to do with the car being designed, and then they tell us, get to California, with the car. And if the car doesn't make it to California, oh boy, we got to get better teachers, better drivers, and not looking at what is the system that you're giving to teachers to use. What is the support? So I think that has a lot to do with why teachers feel beat up. And that's why, again, I say I'm happy to see that teachers at least were beginning to demonstrate, to say, look, we need to have a voice in this. And then, quite frankly, to be honest with you, even as a union leader, I think that unions, to some degree, we have failed our teachers in terms of putting forth the kind of programs and the kind of issues that can help teachers be successful in the classroom. I don't know one teacher who likes to look at failing students. I don't know one that would love to see their students fail. But by the same token, I've heard from teachers over and over again, I have no power. It's the principal, it's the school board, it's everybody else who says, here's the car. You didn't help design it, but you get it to California. So I think that teachers feel that they're being put upon a lot. And at that point, I think teachers are beginning to say we got to stand up. When you're talking about the Janus decision, one of the positives of the Janus decision is that it's going to put the pressure on my union buddies to begin to represent teachers in an educational arena, not just a salary and benefits arena. And that means looking at these choices, school choices, and other things, and how the unions play in that. Because I think if it's one failing in terms of teachers' unions is that we have failed to empower teachers educationally.
Tony, I have a question about this. I was talking to a school leader yesterday, and he said, you know, the teacher shortage is real. It's real, and we are just having a hard time getting people. I'm getting down to just 2-3 people per position, and 4 of those I wouldn't hire. Sure. So I wonder what this sentiment, I mean, is this something that we see that's increasing, and what does this mean for our ability to improve? Because we put a lot of eggs in the basket of if we can improve our teacher quality, if we can get rid of the bad teachers, but if nobody's coming in, that whole model sort of falls apart.
Well, Nat, I think, look, I very much appreciate George's comments about the union, and I have to stand up and take equal responsibility from the education reform community. I mean, you don't have to Google too far to find out some of my comments on these issues. And I would tell you, I've given this, I've told this anecdote. It's a true story. My daughter and I ran a marathon together, so we were always on Saturday mornings, we'd do our long runs. We were out one Saturday morning and we were running, and she's a public school teacher, Title I school. She's a 3rd grade teacher. She goes, Dad, do you think I'm a good teacher? Now, understand, I was state commissioner at the time. And I said, well, Tricia, I think you're a hell of a teacher. She goes, well, how do you know? I said, well, I've seen your 3rd grade reading scores. I've seen your test scores, your I-STEP scores. And I said, I talked to your principal. And she, we're running along, and she looks at me with these big brown eyes, and she said, well, Dad, sometimes I can't. When you make comments that you make, I don't know whether you're talking about me or just the bad teachers. And I think an unintended consequence of the reform efforts that occurred was we alienated a lot of folks who would normally agree with us on issues by lumping a lot of people in and just saying, you know what, teachers are bad. And that's just terrible rhetoric. And a great example, if you took clips of every state that took up educator effectiveness policies, teacher evaluation policies between 2009 and 2013, I promise you're going to hear in every one of those state house debates between legislators somebody say, we've got too many good teachers in our state. That's a hell of a good message. That's not what we should have been saying. So I think a lot of this is multifaceted. Why teachers are upset and why we have a teacher shortage, it's multifaceted. I think George hit a great point about the union. I think the education reform community has to own some of it. And frankly, I think teachers have to own a little bit of it too. I do believe that we needed to do something different. Now, did we do it right? maybe not. But I think there are a lot of reasons, and I think this teacher shortage is real. But it amazes me that some of the potential solutions no one will buy into.
Yeah, I just want to add, I'm not an educator, but I do appreciate teachers a lot. And no one has really talked about salary. And to me, I think that's a really huge issue for teachers. Nashville, I live in Nashville, and it's a growing, wonderful city, but teachers can't afford to live there, period. And so they have to go into way out into bedroom communities outside of the county to find housing. And so I think there's a lack of appreciation there. I mean, just a community not being there for its educators. And so salary, which no one has talked about.
It's a thing.
It's a thing.
I'm going to ask our audience to sort of get in mind your questions, but I have one more for Visha. And one thing that stood out to me was just a bunch of the stuff about the accountability systems and, where should it be? And basically the public responses, the teachers' responses, and the parents had a little daylight between them, but all of them basically said, well, the accountability system we've been setting up for 20 years, we should flip that thing upside down, which is interesting. But even more interesting is how much we've invested in things like state rating systems and information. And I thought it was a pretty tragic slide how few people even knew they existed. So what do you make about that from a parent's perspective? How much utility can we get out of these
I just
things?
asked Paul before this. I was like, hey, what's up with that, right? So I don't know. But, in Tennessee, we just rolled out yesterday, right, this beautiful, wonderful accountability report card. And so I spent hours yesterday going through that report card. I'm like, man, this is so wonderful and easy to navigate and blah, blah, blah. And then a friend of mine, I call her and I'm like, hey, did you check out the report card? And she was like, yeah, I am so stressed out. It wasn't as easy for her. And then to think, the state spent the past couple of years building this thing. And then to think that teachers are not even aware of something like that just blows my mind. And so, they brought in focus groups to test the thing out. It was a big deal, right, to roll this thing out it's a big deal for all states to do that. And so that was really surprising to me to see. Yeah, so I don't have an answer for you, Nat. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So I'd like to now turn to the audience for some questions. We have two rules when we do Q&As here at AEI. The first is if you'll just stand up and give us your name and your affiliation. And the second one is that you ask a question. So if you'd please do that, and we have some microphones coming around. So if you'll just, I think there's one in the back here.
Hi, Susan Sclafani, longtime educator, local, state, national level, now a consultant. I think Vesia hit on a critical point here, and that is that if we're not attracting the same people we used to attract into education, because now there are so many other options. When I was in school, it was social worker, nurse, teacher. That was it. Now the doors are open for both women and people of color. So how do you think we're going to be able to attract them beyond Teach for America, which brings them in for a short period of time? How are we going to get those people back in with the kind of salaries that we're offering and the benefit systems that we offer?
That is a great question. And I just happen to believe in money because, I like to eat. I like to, pay my mortgage. And I'm sure the teachers do too, right? And so, and I want to be able to live in the city, close to the services and close to all the great things that's happening in Nashville. So I'm a big believer in salary. I'm also a big believer in showing appreciation to these people who give up so much for our babies, right? I don't think we do that enough. But it also has to be very intentional. especially when I think about teachers of color, in Tennessee, only like it's a very small percentage of teachers of color in Tennessee. There are, black male initiatives. There's a friend of mine, Sharifa El-Meki, has a great national initiative to get more black males into the teaching profession. So I think something like that just has to be very intentional. I remember back in the dark ages when I was in high school, really, really long time ago, when rap was king, man. But my best friend was a part of a program that, paid her tuition for 4 years. But she had to teach in Tennessee for 5. And so 25 years later, she's still teaching. But so that kind of program, and she had several friends that, so I just think it's really intentional efforts. And I don't know if we have a lot of those. I just don't know.
I would agree with you that money makes a difference, salary makes a difference. I think that you got to pay for quality. And we got to stop being afraid to talk about teacher pay. Teachers are underpaid. Now, there are districts where teachers are paid well. I think the District of Columbia is one of those districts. I think teachers are paid pretty well. Now, the question becomes, money doesn't solve the problem. I agree with that. But you got to pay for quality. I know in the contract that we did in D.C., we implemented incentive pay. Now, that's been a controversial piece, but I do feel that if you want great people, you got to reward them. Now, I'm not one to say that every teacher is a great teacher. I taught for 30 years, and I worked right beside some great teachers, and I worked beside some teachers that I don't want to see my granddaughter even come near them. Now, how do you separate those teachers? And this is one of the things that I talked about in terms of unions have to change, because unions have one shoe fits all, right? That it's all based on what's your educational degree and how long have you been teaching. And one of the things that we try to do is to say, look, what a teacher's degree and how long he or she has been teaching has very little to do with their performance. How do you reward people for their performance? Well, we implemented an incentive program to say that we realize some of you are better than others. It's just like basketball, right? The Cleveland Cavaliers, not everybody is LeBron James. That's a fact. And so in any given school, you got some teacher stars and you got some bench sitters. That's the bottom line, right? How do you pay those superstars unless you're going to have a system that's outside of the degree and years of service? And so that's when you got to be creative and come in with some incentive programs to say, no, all of you aren't equal. There are some of you who are better at what you do than others, and we got to reward you for it, and that's incentive pay.
But I think we've got to ask a question, as you brought it up earlier, about funding. I mean, I live in a state where I think it's Jennifer Wagner's back. Jennifer, I think where I'm right here, Indiana's number 1 in the country in the percentage of the state's general fund that goes to K-12 education. Okay? So my question is, what are the districts spending their money on? What are the districts spending their money on? Because I think there's a lot of information out there that indicates that enrollment, the number of kids in the system has remained relatively static. But the number of adults working in the system has grown exponentially. Now, if we accept the fact that the pot doesn't, that it does have a bottom to it and there's not an endless stream of money, to me, you've got to go to the simplest idea is how do you spend the most money on what is the most important? And we know there's nothing more important than teachers. So what should the local districts be doing to streamline their operations to drive more dollars to the classroom? That is the question that I don't think we ever wrestle with, because the pot of money at the state, you can figure that out. That's revenues. And if you're sending that money to districts and teachers aren't being compensated, my dad was a union electrician. Not, God rest his soul. He, probably wasn't the smartest man in the world, but he did teach me two things. He said, if I want to know what you hold as priorities in your life when you get to be an adult, I will look at your checkbook and your calendar. Well, what do our checkbooks and calendars say that our school districts hold as priorities?
Let's get to another question. Back table here.
Hi, my name is Leah Cruzy. I run Allies for Educational Equity. Hi, George. Hi, Paul. I had a methodological question. The question, the response that raised a number of eyebrows about teachers and trust among different educational stakeholder groups. Did you notice in the crosstabs anything that stood out for which teachers were ranking parents lower or rating parents lower there?
It's that's a great question. So we haven't looked that deeply, and I didn't include it in the charts, but we do have these breakout groups in terms of tenure, length of tenure teaching. So those who are relatively new teachers, 3 years or less, up to 10 years, and then those who are veteran teachers who are more than 10 years. And I haven't been able to. I can't recall the breakouts on those in terms of are those different or by. I think that if I recall that teachers from urban areas were and I can't remember if it was statistically significant, but I think they were a little bit less likely to say they trust their parents, students' parents, or the school board, those stakeholders that were at the bottom. I think the differences were even more pronounced, or those low numbers were even more pronounced among urban teachers. And then I can't, to be honest, I can't recall in the suburban or rural. But I'm happy to, those numbers are publicly available. We're happy to provide them for anybody who's interested.
There's lots of detail in the report, even not in the crosstabs, that's worth sort of breaking down and taking some time in. One or two more questions?
Hey, thank you for coming. I also had a methodological question. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I was curious about the significance. My name's Ian, by the way. I'm a former teacher abroad, and I work as a researcher for the National University of Singapore. I was a little curious about the inclusion of the national spending per pupil statistic. Why would you ask that? You guys have both made reference to the wide range in spending. It's a $12,000 range between, I think, Utah and New York. It's even wider when you get to the district level. So right. Why ask that question? And did that carry on? I mean, was that the first question you asked? Because surely that would color opinions about education afterwards if parents in poor districts, for example, thought that their district was spending way more than it was actually, or parents in rich districts thought that we're spending much less than we are actually.
No, that's a really good question. So in terms of the placement within the survey, it was about a third of the way in the questionnaire, and then remember that so that we half the sample got that information, the other half didn't, and then we thought that the federal national average, which is a good marker to have in our survey, and so in terms of whether people were estimating above or below that, and then what we found is that the EdNext survey they've asked a similar type of spending question, also giving information, and they've done it even by providing that local district per student spending, and see a general similar pattern where that information really does matter in terms of what people's views are in terms of the level of funding. That's a really good question.
We have time for one more question and probably a short response. So last question right here.
Hi, Dean Kern, Deputy for Education at Goddard Space Flight Center. In looking through the report, could you tease out any ways that parents were articulating their preference for one type of education environment over another? I.e., was it curriculum? Was it safety? Was it teacher quality?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we did follow up that question where we ask about their school type preference. We did follow that up with an open-end question so that people could volunteer a response, and then we would code those as people do polls and surveys. They do that with open-end responses. And it's interesting to see differences between those who choose, say, a district school versus a private school versus charter school and homeschooling. And about a quarter of those who say they would like to homeschool, they cite things like safety, bullying as their top reason why they would choose homeschooling. And I think that might be a little bit counterintuitive, but what people might think. And then it strikes me about those who would choose a district school, they cited socialization as their top reason. And we've seen that the last few years. And then comes academics, quality education, and so forth. And then among charter schoolers and private schoolers, and these are not really statistically significant differences, but I mean, they cite individual attention, one-on-one attention, class-sized, student-teacher ratio as a big reason why they would choose that type of school.
Well, it's 5:15, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at the report. I'd like to thank EdChoice and Paul for bringing the data, and George, Tony, and Visha for bringing their perspectives on it. We're going to have a wine and cheese reception outside, so I hope that you'll ask them your questions in person after this. Join me in thanking the panel.
It's great to talk to you.